They fled from the world and found a home in the heart of a rock. Years later, people found traces of their lives and understood who they were. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you are from. The wind carried the last scent of smoke from the campfires, twisting it through the dry grass and over the sleeping valley. In the dim orange glow, shadows moved among the tents of the Apache band, where horses snorted softly and the low hum of voices faded into the stillness of the desert. The night before the sunrise was always the quietest, and for Kaya, it felt like the last breath of the life she had known. She sat beside the dying fire, her dark eyes fixed on the flames as they sank into red embers. Tomorrow her father would stand before the tribe, announce her betrothal, and the drumming would echo through the canyon until dawn. Tomorrow she would become the wife of a man she did not love. Far beyond the circle of tents, down where the rocks began to glimmer faintly in the starlight, a horse waited. Ethan was there, tightening the cinch on the saddle and checking the rifle strapped to his back. His hands moved with the quiet precision of a man who had done this 100 times, because he had, though never before with so much to lose. The scars across his knuckles caught the faint light, reminders of old barroom fights, of ranch jobs that ended in blood, of a life that had never known peace. Tonight, he would steal not gold or cattle, but the only thing in the world worth running for. Kaya rose silently, brushed the dust from her skirt, and walked past the sleeping guards. The moonlight washed her face pale as bone. She didn't look back. Behind her, the camp slept in its circle of firelight, her father's tent standing at its center like a monument to duty. She left the small leather amulet, her mother's, to mark her goodbye. By the time the drums began again, she would be gone. Ethan saw her coming down the slope and felt his chest tighten. He had told himself he could still turn back, that maybe she would change her mind. But as she moved toward him, her figure framed by the silvered outline of the rocks, he knew there was no undoing what they had set in motion. He mounted first, pulling her up behind him. The horse snorted, and they rode into the night, leaving behind the murmurs of the camp and the faint cry of a night bird echoing through the valley. They rode hard until dawn, following no trail, cutting across open ground, where the mesquite grew thick and the sand swallowed the sound of hooves. The sky turned from black to red to blinding gold, and still they rode, until the horse's sides heaved and its breath came in harsh, wet gasps. Ethan slowed, wiped his brow, and looked back, nothing but heat and horizon. By midday the heat was punishing. The land stretched endlessly, a quilt of dust and thorn. Kaya guided them toward a cluster of rock formations, where she knew a spring might lie. She had grown up reading the signs of the land, where birds circled, where certain plants grew thicker, where the wind carried moisture. Ethan trusted her eyes more than his own. When they found the trickle of water, no wider than a snake's track, it felt like a gift. They drank in silence, faces smeared with dust and sweat. The next days blurred together. They followed dry riverbeds, rode through canyons that seemed to breathe heat, crossed plains where nothing grew but brittle grass and ghostly cactus. The food dwindled, dried jerky, a handful of flour, and 2 canteens of water. Kaya made a small pouch of herbs she found, bitter but sustaining. She knew how to chew the roots that eased thirst. Ethan learned quickly to follow her lead. At night, they camped beneath the stars, their small fire shielded by stones. The world around them was vast and empty, filled with the hum of insects and the faraway cries of coyotes. Sometimes they spoke, but not often. Ethan's voice was low, rough from dust and years of shouting over storms and cattle drives. Kaya's words were few, her English halting but clear. When they did talk, It was about things that made the silence between them bearable. The taste of river fish, the smell of rain, the way the sun dipped behind the mesas. But always, behind those quiet moments, there was fear. Fear of the soldiers who would hang Ethan for desertion. Fear of the warriors who would call Kaya traitor. Fear of what might happen if the desert claimed them before either side did. On the fourth day, Kaya saw it first, a faint column of dust on the horizon, straight and narrow, like a ghost arising from the sand. Someone was following. She didn't speak at once. When she did, it was only a whisper. Riders. Ethan turned sharply, shaded his eyes, and saw it too. 2, maybe 3 horses, miles away but closing fast. He spat into the dust and said nothing. The decision was already made. They turned off the faint track and headed into the broken lands, where the hills rose in waves of red stone. By evening the ground turned steep, the air cooler. They dismounted, leading the horses by hand. The sun sank behind the ridge, throwing long shadows across the canyon. When the first stars appeared, Kaya's mare stumbled. She went down hard, her leg twisted at an unnatural angle. The sound she made was small, almost human. Kaya knelt beside her, stroking the trembling neck. Ethan watched, jaw clenched. The mare's breathing grew ragged. He knew what had to be done. He took his revolver, stepped forward and paused. Kaya nodded once, tears cutting lines through the dust on her cheeks. The single shot echoed off the rocks and faded into silence. They buried the animal in shallow earth, marked the spot with stones. After that, they didn't speak for a long time. The night grew colder, and the stars hung lower, sharp and endless. Ethan wrapped his coat around her shoulders, and they climbed the slope on foot, leading the remaining horse until even it could go no farther. Near dawn, Kaya stopped, her head tilted slightly, listening. Faintly, beneath the wind, there was another sound, a steady dripping, like water falling from height. She followed it along the rock face until her hands brushed damp stone. A narrow crevice opened there, almost hidden behind tangled brush. Ethan widened it with his boot, and a rush of cool air touched his face. Inside it was dark and deep, smelling of minerals and age. They stepped through the opening, and at once the sound grew louder. Water striking rock. The passage curved, then widened suddenly into a chamber. Light filtered down from a crack high above, catching the spray of a small waterfall. Beneath it, a pool shimmered. Ethan knelt and drank deeply, the cold biting his teeth. Kaya smiled faintly for the first time in days. The walls of the chamber were smooth, shaped not by nature, but by hands. There were marks of tools, rough but deliberate. Farther in, beyond the pool, stood a structure of stacked stones, a wall, a doorway, the remnants of a man's work. They stepped closer. There was a hearth built into the rock, blackened by soot. A rusted kettle lay overturned, a few nails driven into the stone for hanging tools. In one corner, a beam of wood half buried in dust still held its place, part of what had once been a roof. Whoever had built this place had done so to last. Ethan stood for a long while studying it. The sense of shelter, of something human in the wild emptiness, filled him with a strange calm. Someone lived here, he said quietly, almost to himself. Long time ago. Kaya ran her fingers over the wall, tracing the tool marks. He left before the stone forgot him, she murmured. They built a small fire by the hearth, the flames painting the walls with amber light. Outside, the desert wind howled faintly through the narrow crack, but inside it was still. Kaya lay on the ground near the warmth, eyes half closed, listening to the sound of the dripping water. Ethan sat beside her, staring into the fire, his rifle across his knees. He felt the weight of everything they had left behind pressing on his chest. The camp, the anger of her people, the laws of his own. Yet here, in this hollow carved from the mountain, none of that seemed to matter. He looked around the chamber again, the soot-blackened ceiling, the stone floor worn smooth by forgotten boots. A man could live here. A man could build something, even if the world outside had no place for him. When dawn came, a narrow beam of light cut through the crack above, striking the far wall in a clean, golden line. The smoke from their fire drifted lazily upward, and for the first time since their flight began, they felt safe enough to rest. Kaya slept with her head on Ethan's arm. He lay awake, listening to the distant echo of falling water, and thought that perhaps they had not simply found a hiding place. Perhaps they had found the beginning of a life. Outside, the rider's trail faded into the red horizon. The desert swallowed their tracks as it always did, keeping its secrets. Inside the stone, two fugitives from two worlds began to breathe in rhythm with the mountain itself. Slowly, quietly, as if the land had been waiting for them all along. Morning came slowly inside the hollow of the mountain. Light filtered through the crack above the waterfall, glancing off the shifting surface of the pool and scattering across the walls in thin silver ribbons. Ethan stirred first, his back stiff from the stone floor, and his mind still caught between dream and waking. For a moment he forgot where they were. The air was cool, damp, and utterly still, so unlike the wide-open plains he had known all his life. Then he saw Kaya by the water's edge, kneeling to wash the dust from her hands, her dark hair falling loose over her shoulders, and the memory of the night before settled back into him like a slow, heavy truth. They had found shelter, not freedom, not safety, yet, but something close to both. He rose and walked toward her, the soft sound of his boots on the stone echoing faintly in the chamber. The waterfall wasn't higher than a man, yet its rhythm was steady and sure, as if it had flowed through centuries without ever faltering. Kaya cupped the cold water in her palms and handed it to him without a word. He drank, feeling the shock of it clear his head. Around them, the cave was wider than it had first appeared. The back wall was lined with old beams of wood, half rotted, the remnants of what might have been a partition or a small room. Near the hearth, a broken tin cup rested on a shelf carved directly into the stone. Whoever had lived here must have been alone. One man, perhaps, or a pair of miners who struck no luck and left before the desert took them. Kaya was already exploring, her movements quiet and deliberate. She touched the marks on the wall, the cuts left by tools, the old soot above the hearth. There was reverence in her gestures, as though she were reading a language of the past. "He built it for the wind not to find him," she said softly, and Ethan, though he did not fully understand, nodded. He felt the same thought turning in his own chest. They were fugitives, and now they had stumbled upon the ruins of another fugitive's dream. That day, they worked without much speaking. The fire had burned low, and Ethan ventured outside to gather what he could. The sun was blinding after the dimness of the cave, the rocks hot to the touch. He found dry brush near the base of the ridge and gathered it into his arms, careful to leave no trail. When he returned, Kaya had already cleared the stone floor, sweeping dust aside with a branch. She had hung their blankets across the narrowest part of the entrance to keep the heat out. The small fire they built sent smoke curling upward into the shaft of light. The smell of smoke and earth mingled, familiar and almost comforting. For the first time in many days, they ate without haste, just a strip of dried meat and the cool water from the pool. As they sat there, Ethan studied her profile in the firelight, the calm strength of her features. She was no longer the frightened girl slipping through the shadows of her father's camp. The desert had already changed her. carving patience into her like wind etching rock. By the second day, they had begun to think of the place not as a hiding spot, but as a home. Ethan repaired the doorway using old boards he had scavenged from the remains of a nearby shack he'd found half buried in the sand. He made a latch of rope and wood so that no light would escape at night. Kaya discovered a small hollow behind the cave where moss grew thick and damp. From it ran a trickle of water that could be guided into a basin. Together, they shaped the stones around it to make a cistern. The sound of running water became part of their days, constant and reassuring. At night, they listened to the coyotes call across the canyon, the sound distant and haunting. The echoes rolled through the rock like old voices. Ethan lay awake more often than he slept, his hand on the rifle beside him, but as days passed and no riders came, the tension in him began to ease. He started to rise before dawn, step outside into the thin chill, and watch the horizon turn pale. Kaya joined him sometimes, standing barefoot on the stone, her arms wrapped around herself against the cold. She said little, but in those silences, they felt an understanding deeper than speech. Weeks turned to months. Their supplies dwindled, and Ethan set traps near the creeks that wound through the lower valleys. He built crude snares for rabbits and stretched their skins to make soft coverings. Kaya learned to shape clay from the riverbed into small pots, hardening them in the coals. They gathered seeds, roasted cactus fruit, found patches of wild onion. Survival became a rhythm, harsh but steady. Sometimes, when the wind shifted, they caught faint echoes of gunfire far away, signs of the world they had fled. Ethan would glance at Kaya, and she would meet his eyes with quiet certainty. They would not go back. Whatever battle still burned beyond the horizon no longer belonged to them. Winter came without warning. The first storm swept through the desert like a ghost, filling the air with sharp sand and cutting the temperature in half. The cave became their refuge, the fire their center. Ethan blocked the cracks in the doorway with dried mud, and Kaya wove coverings from old cloth to hang along the walls. The nights were long. They spoke in murmurs, voices swallowed by the sound of the wind outside. Ethan told stories of the ranch where he'd worked, of the open plains where the cattle stretched as far as the eye could see. Kaya, in turn, told of her mother, of the dances held in the moonlight when the whole tribe gathered to honor the spirits of rain. Each story softened the edge between their worlds until it felt as if they had always belonged to the same one. One night, when the fire burned low and the stars glimmered faintly through the crack above, Kaya spoke of the future. Her voice was calm, but there was a tremor beneath it. "If we stay, the mountain will remember us," she said. "If we go, it will not." Ethan looked into the dying coals. "Maybe that's enough," he murmured, "to have a place that remembers." She smiled faintly and reached for his hand. Spring crept back across the desert slowly, the air warming by degrees, the brittle grass turning green. The rains came once, soft and brief, leaving the smell of wet dust that lingered for days. The pool in the cave swelled, and from the rocks sprouted small yellow flowers that opened only at dawn. Kaya tended them like treasures. Then came the morning when she stood by the fire, silent and pale, her hand resting on her stomach. Ethan saw the change in her face before she spoke. When she told him she was with child, he felt the world tilt beneath him. For a long while he said nothing. He had buried too many people, lost too many places to believe easily in beginnings. But when she took his hand and pressed it against her, when he felt the faint life stirring there, something inside him softened. Fear did not vanish. It never did. But it became smaller than what it faced. The months that followed were a lesson in endurance, Kaya's strength never failed. She moved with quiet purpose, preparing for what was to come. Ethan worked from dawn till dark, reinforcing the roof, building a cradle from spare wood, hunting further afield. He grew lean, sunburned, and silent, but his eyes carried a steadiness that hadn't been there before. The desert gave nothing freely, yet it had given them this a reason to keep building. When their child was born, the night outside was black with storm clouds. Thunder rolled over the mountains, and the rain came in sudden sheets, filling the cave with the sound of 100 drums. Kaya's cries mixed with the thunder, fierce and alive. Ethan did what he could, boiled water, tended the fire, held her hand through the hours that felt endless. When at last the wailing stopped, and the small, fragile cry of the newborn filled the hollow, it was as if the storm had found its echo. Kaya cradled the child against her chest, her face streaked with sweat and tears, and Ethan stood beside her, unable to speak. They named the boy without ceremony. He was neither of one world nor the other, his skin the color of sun-warmed clay, his hair dark like his mother's. In him, the land seemed to find its balance. Years passed quietly. The child learned to walk on the smooth stone floor, to laugh at the flicker of firelight, to chase lizards near the entrance of the cave. Ethan taught him to ride, using the one horse that remained. Kaya taught him to listen to the sound of wind, to the language of the earth. Together, they shaped his world between two silences, the endless desert outside and the slow breathing of the stone within. Sometimes strangers passed through the valley below, hunters, prospectors, men looking for something they could never keep. The family watched from the shadows, unseen. Once, a wagon stopped near the ridge, its driver shouting into the wind before moving on. Afterward, Ethan checked their trail, brushing away every footprint. The fear of discovery had not left him, but it had become something quieter, a habit rather than a wound. In the 3rd year, the house began to change. The soot on the walls was replaced with carvings. Ethan's rough lines marking the seasons, the child's small handprints beside them. The hearth grew black with use, and the pool glimmered steady through every drought. Their life was simple, marked not by the passing of months, but by the rhythm of chores, tending traps, drying meat, patching the roof, soothing the child's fever. Once, in the heat of summer, Kaya fell ill. The air was thick, the sun merciless, and she could barely breathe. Ethan carried her to the pool, bathed her forehead with cool water, whispered words that sounded like prayer, though he had never believed in any god. She recovered slowly, and when she did, she smiled at him in a way that told him no fear could ever again own them. The seasons turned as if the mountain kept time for them alone. Outside, the world changed. Forts rose, railroads stretched, wars ended, but within the stone walls, days followed one another in quiet persistence. And yet, even in peace, Ethan sometimes woke before dawn, listening to the silence. He thought of the men who might still remember his name, of the tribe that might still curse hers. He thought of the boy who would one day ask where he came from. Then he would turn toward Kaya and the child sleeping beside her, and the questions would fade. The truth was simple. They had made a life where no one else had dared to look. One morning, as the sun rose through the narrow crack and painted the cave in gold, Ethan took his knife and carved a single word into the wall above the hearth. The boy watched him from the shadows, curious. Ethan stepped back, wiping the dust from the letters. The word was plain, the edges uneven. Home. Kaya saw it later and said nothing. She touched the carving with her fingertips, then laid her palm over it. The stone was warm. Outside, the desert shimmered with heat, and the sound of wind over the rocks was steady and calm. For the first time since the night they had fled, There was no need to measure time by fear. Their lives, quiet and stubborn, had rooted themselves deep in the heart of the mountain, and the stone held them like memory. Thus the house that no one had sought became the house that would not be forgotten. It stood silent beneath the red cliffs, its hearth alive with smoke, its walls bearing the mark of two worlds that had found their peace in each other. And as the years turned beyond the desert, the family that once hid from the world learned, day by day, what it meant not just to survive, but to belong. The years in the stone passed like water through narrow hands, slow, unnoticed, and yet each drop leaving its trace. By the time the boy turned 6, his laughter had filled every corner of the cave, his small footprints pressed into the dust around the hearth. Outside, the desert stretched the same as ever, the ridges and shadows unchanging. But for Ethan and Kaya, time had softened the edges of fear. They still lived cautiously, still stepped quietly beyond their shelter. But the urgency of their flight had long since given way to rhythm. Every dawn began the same. The cry of an eagle above the ridge, the creak of leather as Ethan saddled the horse, the faint smell of smoke from the fire Kaya kindled before the sun reached the opening. Their lives, once built upon escape, had become a quiet covenant with the land that had hidden them. Yet the mountain never let them forget what they were. A family built upon defiance, a union the world beyond those cliffs would never understand. Sometimes Kaya would stand at the cave's mouth, her hair lifting in the wind, and watch the endless plain below. The boy would tug at her skirt, asking what lay beyond the farthest hill, and she would only answer, "The rest of the world." Ethan heard the longing in her voice, though she tried to hide it. He felt it too, creeping into his thoughts like a shadow. There were moments, rare but real, when he caught himself dreaming of the sound of another voice, of the smell of wood smoke from a cabin not carved into stone. It was in late summer when the change began. Ethan had ridden down into the valley in search of better hunting, following the tracks of deer. The air was heavy with dust and heat, and when he paused to water the horse, he saw a thin line of smoke far to the south. It rose straight and steady, too, even to be an accident. It meant men, maybe a camp, maybe something more. He sat long on the ridge, the reins loose in his hands, watching. When he returned to the cave, Kaya was waiting at the entrance, her face unreadable. He told her what he had seen. For a moment, neither spoke. The sound of the waterfall echoed behind them, soft but insistent. "They're near," she said quietly. "Someone always comes when the season turns." He nodded. "Maybe hunters, maybe settlers. But there's smoke where there wasn't before." That night the wind changed. It blew from the south, carrying the faint smell of horses and campfire. Ethan barely slept. His instincts, dulled by years of peace, awoke again. He checked his rifle, counted the bullets, walked the ridge at dawn. From high above he could see the tracks, hoof prints in the dust, a trail winding up toward the foothills. Whoever they were heading toward the mountains. He came back late in the day, his shirt streaked with sweat and dust. Kaya met him with a calm that steadied him more than her words ever could. "If they find us," she asked. "Then we go north," he said. "But not yet." For 3 days they waited. Each morning the smoke appeared closer, faint wisps drifting above the lower ridge. The boy sensed the tension, though neither parent spoke of it. He asked why his father cleaned the rifle so often, why his mother packed dried food into a sack. She only said they might travel soon. Then, one afternoon, while the light still held the pale gold of late day, Ethan saw movement beyond the rocks. 2 riders climbing slowly through the canyon. He crouched near the edge, heart steady, eyes following their path. They wore dusters and wide-brimmed hats, their horses thin from travel. They looked like cattlemen, not soldiers. Still, he watched until they reached the stream below and stopped to water their mounts. From the distance, he heard their voices, a laugh, the clink of a canteen. When they turned toward the ridge that hid the cave, his breath caught. But after a few minutes, they turned back south, talking as they went. That night, as the stars settled into their old places above the ridge, Kaya spoke again. "They will come again," she said. "Others will find this place. Nothing stays hidden forever." Ethan sat beside her, the boy asleep near the fire. "Maybe that's not a bad thing," he answered after a long silence. "Maybe it's time we stopped hiding." Her gaze lingered on the darkness beyond the doorway. "The world down there," she said softly. "It has not forgotten how to hate." "I know," he said, "but maybe it's learned something else too." When dawn came, he saddled the horse and rode down to see. The air smelled of rain. The old trail, half lost under sagebrush, led him toward the plains. The land was changing. He saw tracks of wagons, broken fences, even a piece of metal glinting in the dust. Near the river, he found a half-built cabin, smoke curling from a chimney of stacked stone. 2 men were working there, white men like himself, though younger. When they saw him, they waved. Their rifles rested against the wall, but not in their hands. Ethan approached cautiously. They greeted him with easy voices, asking if he'd come from the north. He told them only that he'd been living out near the ridges, trapping and hunting. They spoke of a new town rising along the river, of peace with the tribes, of soldiers recalled east. One man said the railroad was coming, that soon there'd be a line of smoke and iron running across the valley. Ethan listened in silence. The idea of peace felt like a story told to children, yet the men before him carried no fear, no hatred in their words. They offered him water, asked nothing more. When he rode back toward the mountain, the wind at his back carried the sound of their hammers striking nails. Sharp, rhythmic, alive. Kaya was waiting when he returned. He told her everything: the men, the cabin, the talk of peace. She stood still for a long time, her eyes fixed on the line of the horizon, where the light was fading. "Maybe it is time," she said finally. "The boy should know the sun beyond these walls." So they began to prepare. Ethan packed their few belongings, the tools, the old pot, the rifle, the carved cradle their son had long since outgrown. Kaya gathered seeds from her small garden, wrapping them carefully in cloth. The boy helped, his excitement bright and unguarded. For him, the world beyond the cliffs was a promise. For them, it was a risk they had chosen to face together. The morning they left, the sky was clear, the air already warm. Ethan turned once to look at the cave. Smoke still drifted from the last fire they had tended, curling upward through the narrow crack. The word he had carved above the hearth caught a glint of sunlight. Home. He reached up, pried the small piece of wood that bore the same word from the wall, and tucked it into his saddlebag. Kaya stood beside him, her hand in his, their son between them. "It will always be here," she said, "even if we never return." The descent was slow. They followed the dry riverbed, the boy riding before his father. By noon, they reached the lower valley, where the land opened wide and green, scattered with cottonwoods. In the distance, a handful of cabins stood, thin trails of smoke rising from their chimneys. Dogs barked. Somewhere, a woman's laughter carried on the wind. They stopped at the river to rest. The boy splashed in the shallows, chasing fish. Kaya knelt to wash her hands in the cool water, watching the reflection of clouds drift past. Ethan stood beside her, scanning the far bank. He felt no fear, only the strange unease of a man stepping from shadow into daylight. They followed the river until they reached the settlement, a cluster of cabins, a corral, a small wooden church with a bell that gleamed like copper in the sun. The settlers eyed them cautiously but not with malice. Ethan spoke first, offering to mend fences, to shoe horses. His voice carried the rough honesty of a man who expected nothing more than fair work. Kaya's presence drew stares, yet when one woman's child fell and scraped his knee, Kaya knelt to tend it, crushing herbs between her fingers, whispering words the settlers did not understand, but felt. By evening, their caution had softened into curiosity. Within weeks, they were part of the small community. Ethan built their own cabin near the river, sturdy and plain, its roof thatched with reeds. He worked with the others through the long days, his hands calloused, his shoulders burned by the sun. Kaya tended to the sick, helped the women gather food, taught the children which plants healed and which harmed. Their boy ran barefoot with the settlers' sons, his laughter echoing through the fields. Some called him the half-blood, but without cruelty. Time, it seemed, was beginning to teach gentleness. Every evening, as the sun sank behind the ridges, Ethan would walk up the small hill behind their cabin and look northward. He could see the faint line of the mountains where their old home lay hidden, a smudge of shadow against the dying light. He thought often of the cave, of the quiet drip of water, of the word carved into the wall. He missed its silence, but he did not regret leaving. The silence had protected them once, but it had also held them apart from the world they now belonged to. Years passed. The boy grew tall, his hair sun-lightened, his hands quick. He learned to read from a worn Bible one of the settlers gave him, and later began teaching the other children their letters beneath the cottonwood tree. People started calling him teacher, though he was barely a man. Ethan and Kaya watched him with pride and disbelief, seeing in him, both of them, and something entirely new, something that belonged wholly to the land itself. One autumn evening, long after the harvest, Ethan saddled his horse and rode alone into the mountains. The air was cool, and the stars bright above the dark peaks. He followed the old trail, rough and half lost to time, until he reached the narrow pass. The cave was as he had left it. The hearth still blackened, the pool still shimmering beneath the trickle of water. He set a small fire and sat before it, listening to the echoes of memory. He placed the wooden plaque with the word, home, back upon the stone wall. His hair had turned gray. His hands bore the map of years. "You kept us," he whispered into the quiet. "Now, keep our story." When he left, the fire burned low, its light flickering against the walls. The smoke rose through the crack above, into the night that had first sheltered them. When he returned to the valley, Kaya was waiting on the porch. She knew where he had gone without asking. Together they stood, watching the stars rise over the mountains. Their son's voice drifted from the cabin, reading aloud by lamplight. The sound filled the air like a promise, and so the years folded one into another. The cave remained hidden, untouched, holding within its walls the memory of two souls who had defied a world to build their own. Travelers sometimes passed near it, pausing to drink from the pool or to rest in its shade. Some noticed the word, carved above the hearth, weathered but clear. Home. None knew who had written it, yet those who saw it often said they felt something there, a calm, a weight, a sense that love, once carved into stone, never truly fades. Ethan and Kaya grew old together, their lives bound to the valley and to the son who carried both their worlds in his heart. When people spoke of them, they did not call them fugitives anymore, nor outcasts, nor even pioneers. They were simply the ones who came before, the man who built the first house near the river, the woman who healed with her hands, the couple whose story no one could tell without lowering their voice in respect. And when their son grew to teach the children of the valley, He would sometimes pause beneath the open sky, close his eyes, and see the image of that mountain home, the flicker of a fire, the echo of dripping water, and the carved word that had named their life. In that vision lay everything his parents had fought for. Not escape, not forgiveness, but belonging. The mountain kept its silence, and the house in the stone endured, waiting for the sound of footsteps that might one day return. Above its hearth, the word still caught the light each dawn, just as it had the first morning they awoke there together, when two fugitives from two worlds had looked upon a hollow of rock and decided it was enough to call it home. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next one. Watch our other stories for more journeys like this, and share this video with friends and family who love a good story.